Managing outsourcing transition. Transition management is the set of activities that inspire after a BPO contract is signed that implements or executes the detailed movement or processes from the client to the service provider. In transitions, you need to have a transition manager who will be responsible for migrating. There is only one constant, change. Breaking down the concept of constantly changing work environment so that we can use transition to function or the process from the client location or organization to the service provider or outsourcing organization. The transition manager needs to be an effective communicator, as the role requires extensive interaction with the clients. Because of the nature of the role, a transition manager needs to have a variety of skills and competencies. First, a transition manager needs to have a strong project management skills, as the migration process are complex projects that requires expert managerial skills. A transition manager needs to be comfortable in working in a cross-cultural environment, as most often the client teams are based overseas. A transition manager needs to have a thorough understanding of the existing business and legal processes and current as well as emerging technologies, as these play a critical role in the offshoring of a business function. Generally, there are two kinds of migrating a function. These are lift and shift and migrate. What is lift and shift? Lift and shift is the most common methodology used when a process is mature. Lift and shift approach is used for migrating. There are several phases in a lift and shift model. First, move a current process to the service provider without changes or improvements. Second, to stabilize the process in the new location. And the third, to re-engineer the process to achieve efficiency gain to do the same output with less full-time equivalents, like modify the process at end user, type strategic automation, combine new roles with others, move process to a production line, negotiate elimination of unnecessary outputs. Items to consider in the lift and shift model would be: one, process change will not affect process control points or outputs can be done by service provider independently. Offshore provider approval of process change is a good practice. An onshore review of the change impacts regulatory control points. Major effort for post-go live re-engineering. Transition phase can be easy, especially if people and process are moved. This may take 3 to 4 months only. Risk of losing political will to re-engineer process for a while because decisions will be made in the new location. Transition strategies and knowledge transfer framework. First, framework. There are certain advantages in the lift and shift model. Lift and shift advantages of a lift and shift as is basis process migration. Second, the training the new team is easier as the process is well understood and documented. Existing employees at the donor location are available to support the process in case of disruptions or instability. A fresh set of eyes or a new team look at the process from a fresh perspective, often resulting in process improvements and enhanced controls. Second, framework. Re-engineer and migrate. It is defined as the fundamental rethinking and radically redesigning of the business process so as to achieve dramatic improvements in critical measures of the performance, such as cost, service, and speed. Items to require to consider when doing this process would be: useful when the process is either broken and requires fixing or is due to undergo significant change in the near future, systems change or process change. In such cases, it may be important to utilize their expertise of the existing team, which is built over several years, to drive the change before it is handed over to the new team. Company with outsourced industry common processes to market leading service provider will generally follow the service provider processes. Company change its processes as a part of transition to serve the service provider. Transition success and effectiveness. When it comes to transition success and effectiveness, we look at these points of failure. Most of the issues with subpar or failed outsourcing endeavors can be attributed to a few pitfalls. Inadequate investment and sponsorship. Second, unclear scope of support or scope of work. Training shortcuts. Unclear roles and responsibilities. And the last, not retaining the experts. This can be avoided if the transition manager constantly refocuses attention on these things. Transition critical success factors. The success or failure of a transition or project is fundamentally measured in two aspects. First, technology readiness and state of readiness and manpower readiness. The technology readiness is the state of readiness of the enabling hardware and software to support the ongoing operations. On the manpower readiness, state of readiness of the operating staff hired, trained, and skilled for the service processes. Transition effectiveness can be measured through two things. First, financial benefits, and the second, performance of the team. Financial benefits. It is important to quantify the real cost of the function before offshoring. It's because of the baseline cost. And also to measure the cost of the offshore team on an ongoing basis. Costs related to moving the function to the new team should be tracked separately as project costs. Capturing these cost elements enables comparison of baseline costs with current costs and provides an accurate measurement of the saves. Performance of the team, primarily done by developing the performance metrics. Second, usually subject to a testing phase to determine reasonability of the service measures, also known as the baselining period. Document readiness. It is important that the documents are also ready when it comes to transition. Inputs. Inputs are documented. Source systems and dependencies. These are source system and dependencies, timing of delivery, quality assumptions, and workaround in case of failure in delivery of some inputs, like historical timeliness and accuracy statistics. Helps size service provider resources need. Helps identify likelihood of work compression, like rushing 3 hours work to 1 hour, or overtime, like working late to keep up to output delivery targets. Format of inputs. It can be structured or not. Processes are documented in industry standard format and complete detail. Handoffs to other parties, internal and external, documented including timing and format. Interim or flash reports, if required, are documented as deliverables. Delivery time, day of the month, period targets are documented. Required tools such as macros, workflow application, shared directory access are listed in sufficient details to allow replication in the service provider. Interim or flash reports and final outputs are completely documented. Formats are completely defined. Control steps and quality assurance or checklists are defined. Delivery time or day of period are defined. These are reviewed to ensure they are achievable, consistent with input timelines. Service provider and transition manager should validate that timeliness are current and not aspirational. Tendency to put in desired or unrealistic deadlines when outsourcing can cause major failures. Communication channels for output to be explicitly defined. Clarity here minimizes understanding during early production period, specifically if the output is an output to another process. Onshore supervision points and what will be reviewed checklists should be defined. Some country regulations, like the US, require clear trail of supervisory control by an onshore person. Responsibility for output, like financial statements, rests with an accountable onshore officer. For shared service centers particularly, clear, clear documentation on areas of supervisory review paves the way for transition into center of excellence mode, where supervisory control rests offshore. Work shadowing. Work shadowing is the term used for learn by doing activity of service provider personnel, generally done at the same location as current company performer. Phases of work shadowing. There are several phases of work shadowing. First, offshore personnel doing activity, like service provider staff reviews documentation provided against actual activity done by onshore personnel. Second, changes in documentation are done. Resizing of required staffing may be negotiated at this point. The second one is a guided service provider network, such as service provider performs the activity. Onshore personnel looks over and gives close guidance, may be done onshore or at a service provider site. Completes one or two cycles. If output is monthly, guidance is given in 2-month ends. If output is daily, guidance is given for a few days. Generally, 1 to 2 months of guided work. The third one is go live. This is the time when people or employees will go on live. Service provider performs the activity independently at a service provider site. Performance targets is placed and required. Changes in sizing or process or to correct erroneous training provided by onshore now falls under the change request process and governance. Need to closely monitor for a period of 3 months to ensure stable performance in a new location. Readiness assessment verifies if process to be outsourced is adequately documented. Poorly documented current process will result in most current in-house processes operate on tribal knowledge, undocumented steps. Service providers adding uncertainty of process premium in their proposals, not very clear what will be delivered, how and by when. High probability of he said, she said misunderstanding during initial phase of production. Long work shadowing period and high cost as per service provider tries to document required process. Correctly sized generic resources. First, most current process done in-house operate with long experienced staff, like veterans in role. One FTE with 20 years on the same job experience is not equal to one FTE with general experience no matter how bright or expert or diligent. Without readiness and assessment, the company will estimate the current cost low. The receiving provider may incorrectly size the role, may have to initially use 2 performers with structured steps to do the same 1 FTE job until knowledge is gained or documented. Resource sizing already includes the right level of quality assurance and supervisory control. Most in-house processes rely on veteran performers with long-developed business acumen that allows unstructured sense check for quality assurance. Most contracts, especially shared service center migrations, are under configured business because quality assurance or supervisors are not included. Why is it incorrect? Undersizing a problem. Why is incorrect undersizing a problem? Because service providers will inevitably use the change request process to add to the cost. Adequate documentation for input. Adequate documentation for input. Second, for process. Third, for output. Fourth, communication. Fifth, supervision. There are considerations for input, such as properly described input, second, method of acquisition, third, language of input, timing of the input, and the fifth, dependencies. What are the inputs? Is there documentation listing describing the inputs? Many onshore processes performed by long-time staff would not have existing documentation. Key to know where there are gaps to understand areas of cost of remediation. How are the inputs received? Are they are they in structured form or consistent? Or are they in verbal, email, or even spreadsheet free form? Structured input makes straight-through processing easier, requires less business acumen on part of performer, less training for processor to start, faster growth from new hire to productive performer. Unstructured input data points to early area process for improvement. Efficiency gains from straight-through processing. Are inputs in the same language as that of the provider? Can communication onshore be done in the same language as used by the provider? Second, different language adds cost in terms of language translator or specialist and funnel effect. Is there an input data timing condition? Can be received only on business day? Are the inputs received all throughout the month, or do they peak a single day or period? Peaking inputs may require peak basis staffing to keep delivery target. Extra cost of peak personnel. Challenge of work scheduling to use staff during low periods. Are inputs received only on defined days? Do those days coincide with month ends? Less opportunity to do work scheduling of off-peak staff if work peaks are the same. What are the dependencies? What are the dependencies? What systems? Are they external parties? Dependencies are documented, like output from another system or process must be received first before PP input can be delivered. Which inputs are delivered by external systems and which by internal systems? How stable are the systems? Do they go down regularly? Are there workarounds in case of system failures? How accurate are the inputs? This is about the quality of input. Are there base historical accuracy statistics that can be used to justify cost of measures to improve accuracy? Input errors cost money in terms of rework. Poor quality of input means prior step to validate input must be added. How consistently delivered on time? This is about timeliness. Are there historical timeliness statistics? Can be used to justify investment in faster platforms and process improvements. Late inputs cost money in terms of overtime. Compressed workday burden on the performance, doing 3 hours worth of process in 1 hour to deliver on time. Process checklist. Are the process properly documented? Are handoffs to other parties, external and external, shown in the documentation? Are the interim or flash reports documented? Are delivery time or day of the month or period targets documented? General rule of thumb, if documentation length exceeds the output materially, that is too low a level. Lowest level documentation going beyond 2 to 3 pages is too much. After the process is properly documented, what documentation standard? Process maps, who performs, what are the handoffs to other performers are intuitive. Using specific standards is not important. It is important that a standard is consistently used. After the process is properly documented, are the processes properly documented? How many levels are documented? Must go high-level process? Must document actual outputs sufficiently to allow qualified performer with several years of experience in years process with academic training to replicate output. Must be simple and straightforward. Are the processes properly documented? Are workflow and other technology tools properly referred to in the document? Ideal if workflow platform is used onshore, but this is infrequent. If specific spreadsheets, Access or other end user developed programs are used or macros, it is important that the source code and technical documentation for the macro shared. Are handoffs to other parties, such as internal and external, shown in the documentation? Clear documentation of handoffs show areas of process fragmentation. Handoffs are transfer of the tasks to other people before continuing. Aggregate items to review in a single sign-off step at the end. May be better to require enriched data prior to start of the process, such as intelligent input, template, or trained performer to do the data enrichment. Are interim flash report documented? Flash reports allow onshore supervisions to do early process check. Regulatory submission deadlines are hard. Hence, critical outputs may need intermediate review. Ideal that the process continues without waiting, only stop by exception. Are delivery time, day of month, period targets documented? Indication of required delivery time, date is important in the process of documentation. Quick look at input, receive, and output delivery allows check of process ease and staffing requirements. Tight processing times like late input, early month output, shout out opportunities for required technology or process improvement. How to update or how up to date is the documentation? How often is document recertified? Are they live or modified immediately whenever processes change? Documentation is valuable only if up to date show binders are not useful. Easy to quickly assess live status of documentation. Ask performer about his process. Ask him then point it in the documentation. What steps or procedures of contracting a service provider for the delivery of a process or a service? Delivery targets following defined delivery objectives, defined timelines, accuracy, and consistency. How? With description or documentation of how the service will be performed. There are key operating procedures and control points. In many cases, requirements will include performer qualifications and count required tools for clarity of expectations. Supervision. Stating the supervision process, periodic reviews, and how performance will be measured. Cost. For a clearly defined cost per input, unit, or outcome, and clearly defined bonus or penalty award and basis. Certain consideration of output. First, properly described output. Second, method of transmission. Third, language of the output. Fourth, timing of the output. Fifth, dependencies. Are outputs completely documented? Formats defined. In key management reports, down to the colors of certain data. If output is an input to another process, best that structured template is followed. Periodic changes in output and in contents or format within output are normal, but the change request should be documented, cost justified, and properly approved. How are outputs to be communicated? Transition channel has to be clearly stated. Example, email, file upload, and into SharePoint. As input to another process in workflow or direct entry to another system. Where there are the onshore supervision points? Some country regulations, such as the US, require supervisory control by an onshore person. Example, ownership of the output is with the onshore person. In onshore exercises, who has supervisory control? In shared services, next stage of evolution is true centers of excellence where work and supervision is done in another location. Onshore processes with adequate documentation have greater readiness for offshoring. Documentation and inputs, processes, outputs, communication channels, and supervision allow a service provider like the third part or shared service center to estimate cost of doing the service offshore with certainty. Handoffs. Handoffs are transfers of the output to a different performer, an approver for further action prior to continuation. Reason for handoffs. First, data enrichment. Second, quality assurance. The second performer is the checker. Third, control. This is the approval for materiality and substance is done by a separate person. How do you get paid? First, paymaster creates initial employee pay record. Timekeeper reviews overtime records to add overtime pay. Third, payroll clerk reviews loan records for loan deductions. Fourth, payroll clerk looks at reimbursement records to add payments for expenses advanced by employee. Fifth, payroll looks at the enriched pay record and calculates right withholding tax. Sixth, payroll supervisor reviews the whole pay and approves. Seventh, paymaster submits net salary to bank for payment. Scale. Scale refers to the number of employees. Sufficiency of scale depends on the following. First, service provider. Second, requirement of the job. And the third is the client. Sufficiency of scale depends on the service provider for risk management. A 15,000 FTE provider in a single location may prefer engagement of at least 500 FTEs. 5% is normal buffer of resources and can be ramped up easily for absorbed in other clients when contract ends. Right scale depends on client percentage of outsourced roles to total staff for risk management and control. A 500-person finance organization may want to limit initial outsourcing to say 10% or 15%. A large company with experience in outsourcing may opt to outsource the entire technology group, or from data centers to application development to help desk to a provider, especially if core business is non-IT. Tips to optimize scale. If the process to be outsourced is done by only few FTEs or full-time equivalent, it's not worth outsourcing. Example, create letter of credit, but the role is only done by one person who does everything, or one person full day plus a supervisor for 1 hour a day. Near self-contained roles have good potential for outsourcing because more FTEs covered, complete help desk, mortgage processing from application form acceptance to credit worthiness points calculation to annotation of loan on deed to title insurance submission to recommendation for funds release. For scale to work, it must be considered on both sides, client and service provider. In each instance, both parties have to consider the following. First, end-to-end roles are the ideal. Straight from external contract ends with external contract with only one or two intermediate handoffs for review or approval. Product P&L or the profit and loss starts with transaction data download and ends with submission to regional or senior management. Intermediate activities such as market price verification, calculation of mark-to-market value are fully done by service provider. Buyer needs sufficient FTEs in outsource project to justify risk and execution attention or outsourcing management or finance or payments or legal. What is the amount saved? It is too small. The cost of onshore supervision eats up the benefit of service provider needs sufficient FTEs or margin to justify a risk. Supervisor, operations manager, attention, and overhead, finance, billing, and legal. Large and small engagements have near same overhead in support except for very large contracts. Training, improve hardware and or enhance software. Identifying task candidates for outsourcing. Break down current onshore roles into individual tasks that have scale. Tools for task analysis can be done by follow the performer. Consultant follows the performer and tracks time spent in each task, called stopwatch method because consultants carry timing devices. Time tracker, on the other hand, is when each current performer tracks his activities, how much time is spent on each task over a period of 1 to 3 months. Time tracking into granular task bucket is a good way to identify potential roles for outsourcing because it helps managers assess whether the work can be done simplified. Recording how much time is spent each day in specific task groups. Challenge of simplify now or later. Highlights tasks that occupy a lot of people's hours. Some high-volume tasks may need further breaking up to identify specific roles. High FTE hours numbers are directly pointers for outsourcing. Other subfilters, such as do not require complex market knowledge. Second, do not have financial or regulatory risk. Third, tasks which are self-contained or have minimal handoffs. Tempting to wait and do more granular time tracking and further analysis. Be wary of analysis paralysis. The candidates are finite. They should be documented and sufficient of scale. Considerations are readiness assessment, level of documentation of onshore processes, scale, sizing savings based on current performer count, time tracking or task-based FTE assessment, prioritize roles that are more ready, lift and shift for more documented roles, Cost of low outsourcing readiness. Components of readiness includes scalable talent pool, cost excellent infrastructure, government support, and public-private partnership. So let's have a learning check by this time. By this time, you should be able to do define transition management. Second, what skills are essential for a transition manager? Third, what are the 2 transition strategies? Fourth, what are the transition pitfalls and risks? Fifth, what are the critical success factors? Sixth, what are the measures of transition effectiveness? Seventh, explain the importance of proper documentation. Eighth, explain work shadowing. Ninth, define the components of readiness assessment. 10th, define handoffs. 11th, explain the concept of scale. And 12th, explain time tracking. So that is our presentation for managing outsourcing transition. And thank you for watching.